In this video, we're going to uncover an intriguing escape story of a man who was convicted in the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. and managed to escape several times from the highest security prisons, while masterfully evading capture by the authorities, earning his spot in the FBI's most wanted list. We'll explore the details of his criminal path, which led to his many crimes, as well as the methods and plans he devised to successfully escape from the prison facilities in search of freedom. The story centers around a man called James Earl Ray. He was born on March 10, 1928, in Alton, Illinois, into a big family, in which he was the oldest of the 9 children, with a long history of criminality. From his early years, he was no stranger to unlawful behavior, since his own father, grandfather, and even great-grandfather were quite well-known criminals. From the surviving records of his school activity, we know that he was known for misbehaving, and, even though he was reasonably smart, he was still generally a bad student with easily kindled anger and tantrum bursts. With his unlucky family situation, he wasn't well cared for either. He often showed up at school barefoot and in ragged clothes, not knowing what else to do but create chaos and unrest, disrupting the studying process and violating all regulations. Hence why it was easy for him to drop out completely at around 12 years old, when his father abruptly decided to move to Missouri after an unsuccessful robbery. He needed money to survive but couldn't find any suitable job opportunities to which he would be accepted for his skills. So the easiest path for him was the path of his forefathers: crime. After his first spree of attempted small robberies and burglaries from state to state, he got arrested for the first time in 1949 in California and sentenced to 3 months in prison, since he was quite young and it was his first arrest. But soon after his release, he returned to his criminal tendencies, which resulted in him getting arrested again in 1952 for an armed robbery of a taxi driver in Chicago. During this time, he began thinking about escape for the first time. However, because of his inexperience with the more serious prison systems, all his first escape attempts failed, and he served his full sentence. Several years of imprisonment might have been enough time for many to realize the wrongness of such a lifestyle. However, it seems that in James' case, the criminality was too deeply ingrained in his lineage to be able to change his ways, which only caused him to repeat his mistakes. In 1955, he was arrested yet again, now for a post office robbery in Missouri, now being considered a repeat offender, and thus being sentenced to 4 years in a federal prison. Following which, in 1959, after he tried to rob a grocery shop at gunpoint, he was finally persecuted as a serious danger to public safety with uncontrollable unlawful behavior, receiving a massive 20-year sentence, now in the Missouri Maximum Security State Prison. Such a huge sentence really sobered him up, but instead of thinking like an ordinary person and trying to learn from his mistakes, he decided to finally make his plan of escape work, with him now trying to adapt to the prison life and understand the inner workings of the system better. It took him a few years to develop a trustworthy plan of action, which resulted in his first successful escape in 1967. During his time in prison, he got closely acquainted with the inmates as well as found a place in the position of trust inside the prison. He worked at the prison bakery with some other inmates, with his work consisting of producing large quantities of baked goods for the prison, and even for external export, for which a designated truck for delivery would arrive daily, take the products and transfer them. He knew that for his plans to succeed, he needed allies. Hence why he developed strong and trustworthy relationships with the other inmates who might have been able to help him in the future. His plan mainly included using one of the bread boxes, inside which he would hide, then wait for the bread delivery truck and get past the gates unnoticed. Fortunately for him, his prison buddies agreed to help, probably because they were themselves interested in whether this trick would work. So on April 23, 1967, James got inside the bread box and got covered with the products by the inmates. His heart pounded as he awaited the morning delivery, while the inmates distracted the guards to allow the truck workers to completely unsuspectedly load him onto the truck and then head towards the gates, after which they successfully got past the prison territory. And he finally felt relief. His plan and patience paid off. Once the truck was on the freeway, he jumped out of the truck into the nearby woods and hid there until nightfall. The police and security forces launched search teams to look for him, but they couldn't find him anywhere. The search area was vast and difficult to secure, especially since his escape wasn't discovered immediately. The dense trees and isolated area made finding him almost impossible. Even aerial searches with helicopters failed to spot him because he was well hidden in the forest. James kept moving, traveling from one place to another to evade the police. After he got into a safe town, far from the police on his tail, he went to Chicago, and shortly afterward, he managed to leave the United States entirely, heading to Canada, where he lived for some time, but by March of 1968, he returned to the US, thinking that maybe the hunt after him had relaxed, and settled in Georgia. In his ordinary fashion, instead of maybe trying to start a new calm and stable life, he managed to commit another crime, but this time it would have an effect, not only on his life personally, but would also change the course of the history itself, forever. Unfortunately, at that time in history, the majority of people in the US had racist views, and the racial segregation was commonplace. James was known for sharing such a view as well, since he was raised by people who were steeped in this cultural environment, and there wasn't enough pushback for him to realize the wrongness of this position. This would play a crucial role in his next step on his criminal path. Sometime after returning to the US, James purchased a Remington rifle and then traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, where he rented a small room in a house across the street from another small hotel, called the Lorraine Motel. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, James entered the bathroom of his room, opened the window, and aimed his rifle toward a man standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He fired a single shot, killing the man instantly. That man was Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most significant figures in modern American history. Martin Luther King was the foremost advocate for African American civil rights and one of the most prominent social activists in the civil rights movement. Following the assassination, the police and FBI launched an immediate investigation. The FBI announced James Earl Ray as their prime suspect. During the investigation, they found a map in James's room with circles drawn around Martin Luther King Jr.'s residence and the church he attended, as well as the Remington rifle used in the shooting. All the items carried James Earl Ray's fingerprints. The exact motive for the assassination was unclear, but it isn't hard to imagine what could have been the reason behind such an action, especially in the environment, saturated with racism and white supremacy. Shortly after, the FBI listed James as one of the most wanted criminals in the United States, placing him at the very top of their list and starting a nationwide manhunt. Having spent a lifetime evading police, James was no stranger to being hunted. But this time was different, since now every law enforcement agency in the country was looking for him. Knowing he needed to leave the US. Again, as quickly as possible, he headed north to Canada, where he managed to forge a Canadian passport and use it to board a flight to London, from which he intended to travel to some African country and hide there. However, airport security grew suspicious and detained him. Upon investigation, they uncovered his true identity as one of America's most wanted fugitives. James Earl Ray was arrested on June 8, 1968, 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. After his extradition back to the United States, he faced trial. During the trial, James initially confessed to the murder but later recanted, claiming he only confessed out of fear of the death penalty. However, when confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, his room rifle and fingerprints, James changed his story. He alleged that a mysterious organization was behind the assassination and had used him as a scapegoat. While Martin Luther King Jr. had many enemies due to his civil rights advocacy, no concrete evidence supported James's claims of any such organization. The court ultimately convicted James Earl Ray, sentencing him to 99 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. He was sent to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison and one of Tennessee's most strict facilities. However, he clearly wasn't just about to give up his freedom and stay locked inside brick walls for the rest of his life, and instead immediately began forming the plan for his next escape. The outline of the prison resembled a fortress, which housed some of the most dangerous criminals. There was a harsh environment, where even the slightest wrong move could lead to fatal consequences. The prison was surrounded by a 5-meter-high wall, nearly a meter thick. Escape seemed nearly impossible. The wall was topped with barbed wire carrying a powerful electric current capable of instantly incapacitating anyone who touched it. The electric current running through the barbed wires wouldn't kill anyone instantly, but it was strong enough to knock someone down and possibly render them unconscious. And even if, by some miracle, a prisoner managed to overcome all these obstacles, the prison was surrounded by 9 watchtowers. Guards stationed in these towers were heavily armed and had full authority to shoot any prisoner attempting to escape. Faced with the array of obstacles, James figured the most promising escape route lay below ground. He dedicated considerable time to scrutinizing his cell, searching for vulnerabilities. The most apparent was the vent its metal cover fastened by screws embedded in the concrete. While removing the screws presented no great challenge, the opening was barely large enough for a small child, certainly not a fully grown man. With determination fueling him, James started using a spoon to erode the concrete around the vent, slowly increasing its size. It was a laborious undertaking. Imagine excavating concrete with a spoon. The task would inevitably take several months. Each evening, James diligently scraped the vent's edges, concealing his efforts with a clever concoction of toothpaste and dirt he'd gathered from the prison yard. He mixed these to create a cement-like paste, camouflaging the exposed edges, making it seem like the vent hadn't been touched. Meanwhile, James purposefully shed weight, understanding that the slimmer he became, the easier it would be to fit through the vent. After countless months of this painstaking work, James finally managed to enlarge the vent enough to squeeze through. Beyond the vent existed a labyrinth of pipes that crisscrossed beneath the prison. These pipes carried all manner of things, from sewage to electricity, heating, and steam, all vital to the prison's functioning. At the end of this subterranean pipe system was a large ventilation fan. This fan was designed to expel the air from the prison cells out into the world. James had closely studied the layout, and he was certain that if he got past the fan, he'd find himself outside the main prison building, in the yard. The yard was a logical step. Inmates were allowed in the yard in daylight, under strict supervision. James had observed a ground-level manhole cover that appeared like an entrance to the sewers. Based on his surveillance, he concluded that the pipes beneath this cover likely led to the power station outside the prison walls. The power station provided the prison with both electricity and steam, and James surmised that gaining access to these pipes would provide a route out of the prison entirely. Naturally, accessing the manhole during the day was not possible, as it was always under surveillance. His sole option was to navigate through the ventilation tunnels below the cells, reach the yard unnoticed, and then get into the manhole to pursue the pipes towards the power station. However, there was a significant obstacle in his path. The large ventilation fan was protected by iron bars, which could only be bypassed by cutting through them. James didn't have any tools capable of the job, so he spent several months considering ways to obtain one that would help. He eventually determined he would require assistance from someone outside the prison walls. That someone was his brother, Jerry. As previously mentioned, James was the eldest of 9 siblings, and Jerry, the closest to him, regularly visited him in prison. James crafted a cryptic message for Jerry, requesting his aid. To avoid suspicion, the letter did not state explicitly, "Bring me a saw." Instead, they had agreed on a secret code during one of Jerry's previous visits to the prison, guaranteeing that even if guards read the letter, the message wouldn't be clear to them. Jerry carried out the plan with precision. He acquired a small saw blade and concealed it within the sole of his shoe. He peeled off the shoe's bottom layer, placed the blade inside, then glued the sole back on, ensuring the blade was completely hidden. Jerry made the trip to visit James at the prison. Family visits were allowed but took place in a guarded room. Prior to entering, visitors were meticulously searched to ensure they weren't carrying contraband for the inmates. But because Jerry had hidden the saw blade so expertly in his shoe, it was impossible for the guards to detect. He sat in the visiting room and waited for his brother, who then entered wearing identical shoes. During their meeting, the brothers conversed under the watchful eye of the guard, appearing completely normal to avoid attracting attention, and then managed to secretly exchange their shoes. The guards noticed nothing, and James succeeded in smuggling a small saw blade to his cell. That very night, he descended into the pipe passage and began sawing through the fan's iron bars. James understood that this endeavor would be slow and difficult, requiring months of perseverance. Each night he worked on the bars, and after 4 months of unyielding labor, he was finally able to cut through them. However, the following challenge came as a surprise: the fan bars themselves. The fan was built with incredibly robust metal. James had initially assumed he could simply bend or twist the bars by hand to create a gap, but they were far more resistant than he had expected. No matter how hard he pushed, pulled, or hit them, they would not move. He came to the realization that he would require a different tool to manipulate them, and settled on needing a pipe wrench, a tool that would be large and strong enough to do the job. Obtaining such a tool from outside the prison was not a feasible option, but James experienced a stroke of luck. One of his close friends within the prison, Jake Morlock, was a plumber. Jake's role involved fixing pipes and systems across the prison, which gave him access to tools, such as a pipe wrench. Despite the strict monitoring of these tools, Jake could covertly borrow one for a night. When James confided in Jake about his escape plan, he invited him to participate. Jake agreed and committed to providing the wrench they would need to bend the fan bars. Another problem then presented itself. How would Jake manage to get inside James's cell on the night of the escape, since they aren't cellmates? In the prison, all prisoners were assigned to their particular cells, dictated by a roster held in a nearby office. The roster was written in pencil to make it easy for guards to erase and rewrite names when prisoners were transferred to other cells. James noticed this and thought he could exploit this system. The office holding the roster wasn't locked, as it was deemed unimportant, and inmates could enter it during their free time. Guards patrolling the floor didn't expect any tampering with it. James meticulously observed the guards' routine and chose the perfect day for his plan, May 2nd, 1991. On that particular day, the regular guards were on leave, replaced with substitute guards with less experience who didn't know the prisoners well. Additionally, there were fewer guards than usual, which presented the ideal opportunity. During recreation time, James slipped into the office, and since he didn't have an assigned cellmate, added Jake as his cellmate. That evening, as prisoners were called back to their cells, the substitute guards used the altered roster to guide them. The scheme worked without a hitch. Jake was sent to James's cell under the guards' watchful eyes. Once inside, the two friends waited patiently until 2 a.m., the time of the last guard patrol before the morning count at 6 a.m. As soon as the guards finished their rounds, James and Jake initiated the next phase of their plan. They placed dummy heads they had crafted on their pillows, creating the impression they were sleeping soundly. Should a guard pass by, it would appear that two men were sleeping in their beds. The pair then squeezed through the vent opening. Even with Jake's larger size, he managed to force himself through with considerable difficulty, though it was apparent that he was struggling. Together, they reached the fan and employed the pipe wrench to bend the bars, finally creating a narrow opening. However, the opening was too small for Jake to get through, due to his size. James barely made it through, but for Jake it was not possible. After several attempts to find a solution, they accepted that Jake could not proceed. Reluctantly, Jake returned to the cell, while James continued alone. James emerged in the prison yard as planned, making his way directly towards the ground-level manhole he believed would lead to the power station outside the prison walls. Moving with caution to avoid detection by the guards in the watchtowers, he arrived at the manhole and lifted the cover. But the moment he did, he was met with a blast of extremely hot steam. The pipes below were used to carry steam for heating the prison, and the heat was too overwhelming. Desperate, he climbed back, closing the manhole behind him. Sadly, the escaping steam had attracted the attention of the watchtower guards. As James's head poked out, they spotted him. The guard activated the alarm, and James was quickly captured. He was taken to a secure room for interrogation. The investigation revealed his entire escape plan, including Jake's participation and the altered vent in James's cell. Jerry's involvement also came to light. He had been waiting just outside the prison in a car at a pre-arranged location, ready to assist James escape further. Jerry had even obtained a gun and cash for James once he was free. When James did not show up, Jerry figured that the escape attempt had likely gone wrong. He decided to head back home. Later, he heard on the radio about the failed escape of his brother, who had been apprehended during his attempt to flee the prison. James's meticulously planned escape, which he had worked on for almost 2 years, completely failed. The failure was a severe setback to him. As a punishment, James was placed in solitary confinement for a 2-month period, which meant complete isolation in a small cell, with no interaction or contact with other prisoners. When James was released from the confinement, his thoughts immediately reverted to escape. For someone with a life sentence, escape was the only logical course of action. However, the situation had now become much more difficult. Every guard in the prison was keeping a close eye on him. Despite the intensified scrutiny, James spent years searching for another opportunity, studying every possible vulnerability or loophole in the prison security. 2 years passed, then 3. By 1976, 5 years after his first escape attempt, James was employed in the prison laundry. During routine maintenance within the laundry area, he observed that the workers had replaced several old metal pipes. The workers had left the discarded pipes on the ground, with no one seemingly concerned about removing them. Secretly, James took the pipes, each about 1 meter long, and hid them behind stacks of laundry in the corner of the room. At the time, he was unsure exactly how he might use them, but he had a strong intuition that they could be useful for a future plan. He decided to keep them hidden and await the opportune moment. Time continued to move forward, and by 1977, 6 years had gone by since James's last escape attempt. Every day he scanned for new opportunities, carefully examining the prison for any vulnerabilities that might aid in his escape. One day, while walking in the prison yard, James noticed something that caught his attention. As previously mentioned, the prison walls were topped with electrified barbed wire. However, James observed a small opening where one part of the wall met the adjacent mountainside. In this specific area, the barbed wire was slightly elevated above the wall, leaving a narrow space. It was just big enough for a person to squeeze through without making contact with the wire, avoiding electrocution. James meticulously examined the area. The spot was situated where the prison wall and the mountainside joined, forming a natural advantage. On the other side of the wall, the ground was higher, sloping upward with the mountain. If James managed to climb the wall, he could easily jump down to the other side without injury, due to the elevated terrain. The last obstacle was the scaling of the wall itself. It was at that point that James connected the pieces of his plan. The metal pipes he had hidden in the laundry could be assembled into a makeshift ladder. The idea was clear and straightforward in his mind. He would construct a ladder using the pipes, climb the wall, and escape through the gap in the electrified wire. The plan was daring, perilous, and loaded with risk, but James believed it was his best option. Over the next few weeks, he began working out the particulars of his escape, knowing that every detail had to be perfect. The first issue James faced was that the pipes he possessed were not enough to build a ladder long enough to climb the wall, which was 5 meters high, a considerable height. He needed to find more pipes, somehow. That's when James reached out to a fellow inmate, Jack Shelton. Jack was an experienced escape artist, with a history of attempts from multiple prisons. When James explained his strategy, Jack immediately embraced the idea, deeming it clear, simple, and feasible. James specifically approached Jack because he was employed in the prison workshop. This workshop handled plumbing and metal work and regularly dealt with pipes that were similar to those James had hidden in the laundry room. Incrementally, Jack started to smuggle pipes from the workshop. Pipes were regarded as materials, not tools, so they weren't as closely monitored. Jack succeeded in sneaking out a pipe almost daily, sometimes hiding it in his clothes, other times throwing it out of a window. In time, they gathered enough pipes to complete the ladder. James also brought in a new member of the team, his current cellmate, Earl Hill. Now the team had 3 members, James, Jack, and Earl. Some might wonder why James did not include Jake Morlock, his accomplice from the first escape attempt. The answer was simple. Following their failed attempt, the guards had separated them, placing them in different wings of the prison, so they rarely saw each other anymore. However, the team had a new problem. They couldn't assemble the ladder and carry it across the yard in daylight without attracting the guards' attention. They agreed that hiding the pipes near the section of the wall they were planning to climb would be the best course of action. This was the spot where the prison wall joined the mountainside and where there was a small gap below the electrified wire, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Close to this spot was a small drainage ditch, designed to channel rainwater away from the yard. James and his team concealed the pipes in the ditch, camouflaging them with leaves and other debris. The ditch's recessed placement made it nearly impossible for the guards to spot the pipes unless they stood directly over it and looked down. It served as an ideal hiding place until the moment of the escape. During this time, the team also studied the guards' schedules. The prison had few guards in relation to the number of inmates, and although they were armed heavily and the prison was equipped with watchtowers and electrified wires, this staff shortage was a notable weakness. It allowed James and his team the opportunity to monitor the guards' movements without raising suspicion. The escape was set for Friday, June 10, 1977. That afternoon, during recreation time, James and his team began to put their plan into action. The pipes they had hidden were in place in the ditch near the wall. The first step was to distract the guards, so he managed to set several inmates against each other to stage a fight in the yard, generating a massive distraction. Meanwhile, James and his team rushed to the ditch, pulled out the pipes, and began to assemble the ladder. They had practiced the assembly process thoroughly, so it took them less than a minute. The ladder had a hook-like attachment at the top to latch securely onto the wall. Once it was ready, James gave it a quick test, ensuring it was stable. Everything was ready. The moment they had been planning for had finally arrived. They carefully took the ladder and, with precise movements, positioned it against the wall, after which they successfully secured the hook at the top and began ascending the ladder. After James reached the top, his companions followed him without hesitation. On the other side, as mentioned earlier, the ground was elevated, so they didn't have to jump 5 meters down, risking injury. Instead, the descent was relatively easy, allowing the 3 of them to escape quickly. However, their escape did not go unnoticed. A few other inmates in the yard spotted the ladder and seized the opportunity. In moments, 3 additional prisoners scrambled up the ladder and joined the escape. The last of these was a prison cook who was still wearing his white chef's uniform. The bright white clothing immediately caught the attention of a guard who aimed his rifle and fired at the ladder, striking another inmate who was attempting to climb, who then fell to the ground, pulling the ladder down with him. The remaining inmates who had hoped to escape retreated while chaos erupted in the yard. By this point, James and 5 other prisoners had already made their way into the forest beyond the wall. The prison alarm blared as news of the escape spread. Reports quickly reached the state governor's office and law enforcement agencies. The problem, however, was the prison's remote location, in a small town of only about 500 residents, far from major police or state security facilities. The response was delayed, giving the escapees valuable time to get further away. Despite the slow initial response, the eventual reaction was massive. Local police, state troopers, border patrol, and hundreds of officers from various agencies, including the FBI, descended on the area. The escape became a national story, with media outlets from across the country rushing to cover it. For the FBI, James Earl Ray's escape was particularly alarming. He was one of their most wanted criminals. The search effort was monumental, involving ground teams, helicopters, and bloodhounds scouring the dense forest behind the prison. The forest itself presented its own challenges. It was vast and treacherous, making it difficult for both the escapees to navigate and the search teams to pursue them. James's main goal was to reach some populated town, from which he could eventually navigate his way out of the country. However, as night fell, visibility became a major challenge. In the chaos of the escape, James had lost track of his direction. Adrenaline had pushed him to run blindly, and now, deep in the forest, he realized he had no idea where he was. The dense trees and thick undergrowth made it nearly impossible to orient himself. Now alone in the forest, James pressed forward, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the prison. For 48 hours, law enforcement teams scoured the area. 4 of the 6 escapees were captured within this time, but James was not one of them. He continued trudging through the forest, exhausted, hungry, and disoriented. However, after about 3 days since the escape, a search team's bloodhounds picked up James's scent. The dogs led their handlers through the dense forest, barking frantically as they closed in. James was discovered with his hands raised in surrender. He had crafted the pile of leaves to conceal himself, hoping to remain undetected, but the dogs had given him away. Without resisting, James was arrested and returned to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. The 6th and final escapee was captured shortly after James, officially ending the escape attempt. The failed escape was a national sensation, covered extensively in newspapers and on television. As punishment and some sort of belittling joke, James's sentence was symbolically extended by 1 year, increasing it from 99 to 100 years, which obviously made little difference. Despite this, James attempted several more escapes in the years that followed. However, by then, the prison guards and administration accounted for his tendencies and kept him under constant surveillance, making future attempts nearly impossible. James continued to insist on his innocence in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. for the rest of his life, frequently claiming he had been framed and used as a scapegoat, with even some members of King's family believing him. To this day, debates and conspiracy theories persist about James's involvement. Perhaps he did really play a role in the assassination but was manipulated and used to shield the true perpetrators from exposure. We'll probably never know. In the end, James Earl Ray died in prison in 1998 after a long life deeply interconnected with crime, combined with his unending yearning for freedom, which he couldn't fully achieve, despite his best efforts. This was a truly fascinating story about a criminal who left a mark on history, in his case, unfortunately a negative one, changing the course of entire generations to come, as well as an example for people, as a case study, to think deeply about their situation and instead of following their negative tendencies, try to overcome them and become a better person, who can change the world for good rather than bad, and make their life truly meaningful and worth living as a result. If you've enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to support the channel by liking and subscribing. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave them in the comments below. See you in the next one.